It's October time again. The weather is getting cooler, the nights are getting darker, and there's an unmistakable musk of something spooky in the air, and nothing strikes fear more into a mortal's heart than trying to record yourself in a dark room because your camera's low light mode sucks ass. Yeah, gonna go ahead and turn the light on now if that's alright. It being Halloween, and Halloween being the time everyone has to make their obligatory scary video, that basically means I have no choice but to make a video on a scary game port. And although it was extremely tempting to just talk about Resident Evil on the Game Boy Color, just because it was never finished and can be beaten in about half an hour, meaning I'd barely have to do any work, thinking back, that was probably the better idea, I decided to instead look at a game that set out to do what Resident Evil did, but that actually came out as a finished game you can buy with real money. Welcome to Port Patrol, the show where I look at weird, interesting, or knockoff ports of video games, and today we are taking a look at Alone in the Dark: A New Nightmare for Game Boy Color. Alone in the Dark: A New Nightmare is just one of many reboots of everyone's least favourite survival horror series that I could have sworn had more than 7 games in it, but apparently does not. Now I know nothing about Alone in the Dark, apart from the fact the games are either old, bad, or old and bad. Nowadays the only scary thing about this game is the fact I actually spent $5 on it. But luckily for me, being a reboot means that I don't need any knowledge of the older games whatsoever to play it. So I literally spent $5 on them for nothing. Awesome. Developed by Darkworks, don't worry, I've never heard of them either, this 2001 PS1, PC, Dreamcast and PS2 release took many inspirations from Resident Evil. It's probably the nicest way to put it. So anyone familiar with tank controls, the gameplay loop of finding puzzles and then items meant to solve those puzzles, and exploring large decrepit mansions which are filled with dogs will feel more than comfortable playing this game. Not much else to be said here, it's a really solid game with a really nice torch effect that really adds to the spook factor. Now anyone who's anyone knows that the most effective way to play survival horror games, apart from in the middle of the day with the volume muted because you're a huge wimp like me, is at night time with the curtains drawn, headphones in, with nothing but the TV screen illuminating you for full immersion. So honestly, what better system to port it to than the Game Boy Color? A console that requires the light of several suns directly beaming onto your house to be able to see the bloody screen, and therefore cannot be played in the dark. Actual footage of me trying to do that, or maybe I'm just sat in the dark doing nothing. You can't prove me wrong either way. Developed by Pocket Studios, perhaps most well known for their work on LEGO Racers 2, on the Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy Color version of this game released a week or two after the main release, and sought to do what many deemed impossible, and port a full survival horror experience to the Game Boy. And on first inspection, yeah, I'd say they did it. By far the most striking aspect of this game is the presentation, featuring the same pre-rendered fixed perspective style of gameplay as the main game. It is by far the best aspect of the game, and is honestly the only reason I wanted to play it. It captures the feeling of the original very well, and compared to the, admittedly not finished Resident Evil port, looks incredibly detailed too. This is because Alone in the Dark utilises the Game Boy Color's not very well known high color mode, that sacrifices the amount of sprites that can be on screen at once in exchange for being able to show over 2,000 colours at once. It's what allows for these amazingly detailed backgrounds, by far the game's biggest strength, but rather ironically is also responsible for many of the game's biggest weaknesses. One thing I'm definitely not too hot on is that it's very confusing to navigate. While exploring these wonderfully detailed backgrounds is by far the best part of the game, it can also be a frustrating experience when you can't figure out where to go, mostly because you can't really hide the fact you aren't exploring a 3D space like the game wants you to think you are. Sure, the original had you exploring 2D backgrounds too, but it had actual 3D characters that really helped with depth, and oftentimes with these games there's an actual 3D object you're exploring that's just invisible to the player. It made the game feel more coherent and you know, the fact it wasn't on a Game Boy really helps too. The Game Boy version obviously can't have these 3D elements, so it doesn't have the same level of clarity, especially when the perspective begins to break down in certain places. Not to mention, a lot of the areas of the game have been cut out to make the game fit on a cartridge, resulting in many misleading dead ends, and doors you can't enter that make for a much more confusing layout. It can be hard to see things too. I got stuck at one point because I didn't realise there was a set of stairs back here, and at the top of them I could interact with what I'm guessing is supposed to be a switch, but it just blends in with the rest of the background, resulting in a game that can apparently be finished in an hour, but that took me almost double that just to reach the halfway point. Alone in the Dark follows the same story as the original, although very loosely due to how much of the game has been cut out. You play as Edward Carnby, as you explore the mysterious Shadow Island where your best friend was found murdered. You team up with Aileen Cedrak, who in the original was a playable character with her own set of levels, but here has been relegated to woman who sits in plane and talks to you sometimes, to uncover the secrets of Dr. Morton and the strange ancient artifacts he is interested in. Now, when playing this through the first time, I had assumed these backgrounds had been ripped straight from the original, and that it would follow the same level path as the main game. But I was actually quite surprised at how different the two were. While the location of the game is the same, and it roughly follows the same sequence of events, the layout of the game and the puzzles you have to solve in it have been redone from scratch to suit the Game Boy. So while it is the same map with the same camera angles, you may find certain doors are locked in the original but are open in the Game Boy, and some doors lead to completely different places, which really screwed me over when going to collect footage from the original, let me tell you. In a weird way, just like Edward and Aileen have their own separate campaigns, the Game Boy Color version is almost like a third campaign to play through. This version is by far the simplest one though. Large portions of the game have been removed, puzzles have been simplified, and there's a lot less exposition and items to sort through. In a way, I kind of prefer the streamlined story of the Game Boy game, though I think that's just because I played it first. Sadly though, as good as these amazing, beautiful, pretty neat looking backgrounds are at capturing the atmosphere of Alone in the Dark, the sound design is a big letdown. I mean, I wasn't expecting much, but I was at least expecting something. Walking around, there are absolutely no sound effects whatsoever, apart from in a few select instances if you're really lucky. No spooky ambience, no sounds for opening doors. Hell, even simple footsteps would have been nice over the absolute deafening silence we got here. Music only plays when you're in a cutscene, it's the same song every time. When you're examining something, it's the same song every time. And when you're in combat, admittedly a new song, but one that is literally 4 seconds long. No complaints about the sound effects when they do appear though. You know, they're about as good as a Game Boy can do. But it's the lack of sound effects that really hampers things. Even Resident Evil had some music playing over the gameplay, and that game wasn't even finished. And I know you're probably thinking that I'm bringing up Resident Evil a lot. But if they didn't want me doing that, then maybe they shouldn't have bragged about being better than it during interviews. I'm not even asking for much. Just some sort of music to play in each area, so that I'm not sat in silence contemplating what I'm doing with my life as I play it. That's like 6 songs at most, come on guys. Oh, and a combat song that wasn't just a 4-second loop. Wouldn't mind that either. What really hampers this game's enjoyability factor though, is the combat. It completely goes against the entire philosophy of survival horror, and is in all honesty, a bit crap. I mean, sure, whatever, I get it. You know, you can't expect the Game Boy to pull off true survival horror, is what I would say if the unfinished Resident Evil port didn't already prove that. Oh yeah, actually you can. because of this game's insistence to use the high colour mode, which was only ever really used for point-and-click adventure games or for cutscenes. The game can't actually display enemies at the same time as the player. So instead of the same genuinely tense and intimidating encounters from the original game, you instead get random battles like Final Fantasy. At random points in the game, you'll be sprung into combat, accompanied by Carnby monologuing to himself every single time, and shunted into a combat phase that is completely separate to the rest of the game in both gameplay and presentation. Now this would be fine, but the biggest issue is that you can't even leave these fights until all the enemies are dead, which goes against everything the original stood for. Conserving ammo, managing your inventory, and picking your battles are all aspects that came together to make a great survival horror game. But now you have no choice but to fight, are given 99 bullets straight from the get-go, and can't even access your inventory mid-battle. So it really sucks to be you if you wandered into a fight with low health. And even though that all really sucks, it would at least be forgivable if the combat was any good. It's not. They somehow took a game where the single noteworthy characteristic of the main character was that he owns a double-barreled revolver, and then randomly stumbles across a triple-barreled shotgun. They made that not fun. You move horrendously slow, it's hard to tell what you're going to shoot, there's no tactics involved but fire as fast as you can, and all the enemies move at the same speed as you, making it impossible to get away from them to shoot safely. It sucks because this game has a lot of potential. The exploration sections work really well for the type of game it's trying to emulate, but its insistence on using the Game Boy's high colour mode absolutely butchered it. Ideally, they should have either gotten rid of the high colour mode and made it more like the Resident Evil port, where combat takes place at the same time as exploration, or they should have just ditched these sections and expanded the combat phase so the entire game would have been playable in it. Having these two conflicting gameplay styles really breaks the flow of the game, especially when they've both been so heavily compromised to work together. They should have picked one or the other, definitely not both. Alone in the Dark: A New Nightmare is a very ambitious port, but its ambitions were way too high and ended up compromising the entire experience. Having exploration and combat take place in two separate instances absolutely ruins any scare factor this game could have had, if it even had any in the first place being a Game Boy Color game. Of course, it could be argued that the entire idea of having a horror game on a Game Boy was futile anyway, because the hardware was clearly not capable at all of delivering that type of game. And yeah, you know, you're probably right, but Alone in the Dark came very, very close. And it's a damn shame it didn't quite reach the heights of the original, or even its unreleased rival. Overall, I don't think I enjoyed playing it. That's definitely not the right word, like, at all. But I certainly found it intriguing and interesting to play, which is probably about as close to a compliment I'm gonna be able to give it, to be honest.